Hello, it's time for Module 4 in the short course on risk-based decision making. Today's module is on the foundations of a risk-based approach. So the learning objectives for this module are shown here. Number 1, to understand when decision analysis is needed, because sometimes it's not needed, and understand specifically why it's useful for risk-based decision making, and then to understand what is meant by a risk-based decision. So decision analysis, as hopefully you've started to see through these readings and through the modules, is a useful tool, and it's also a tool that takes time and energy to invest in. And so when it's not needed, that might be a waste of resources. So when it's not needed, it can be overly burdensome and take too much time to make important decisions. So there's many situations in which the best decision is fairly clear. There's one option that really stands out above the best. There's one option that everyone agrees on. In those cases, a decision analysis probably is not needed. But it is useful to use decision analysis when the decisions are difficult. And so I want you to think about, just for a few seconds here, think about some decisions that you made that were difficult, either decisions in your personal life or decisions that you were involved with at work or at school, and think about what made them difficult. So there's some research from decision analysis that talks about what are the kinds of things that make decisions difficult, and they're shown here on this slide. Things like complexity in outcomes and options. So when you have many different options, many different outcomes that you care about, and they all kind of have different types of information, and there's complexity there. Also, when there's uncertainty in the outcome, so you're saying it's going to have a certain cost or it's going to have a certain impact on risk, but it's not. There's a lot of uncertainty in those data that you're not really confident that you know for sure what it'll be. It could be a little bit more, a little bit less. When there's competing viewpoints about what outcomes are important, so there might be some stakeholders who believe the risk information is the most important, and some stakeholders who are concerned about cost. And when you have people that are coming at it with different priorities, that's going to make the decision very difficult. When you have multiple conflicting decision outcomes, so things like when you get more of one, you get less of the other, so you can't have everything that you want, and so you have to make those trade-offs. That makes decisions difficult. When you have high stakes decisions, when the decision is going to have an impact, an important, significant impact on a lot of people, and then when it impacts multiple people. So these are all things that are very typical in many food safety decisions, unfortunately, and so that's why using the decision analysis approach to support these kind of decisions is important. But I did want to make that note that if you have a situation in which the decision is not difficult, then a decision analysis probably would be not needed. So now that you know a little bit about the research and decision making generally, I want to focus more on risk-based decision making and go a little bit deeper in that topic. So as I mentioned earlier, this term is being increasingly used by government agencies and private sector decision makers to describe their work. But the question is really, what does it mean when you say something is a risk-based decision? So as I mentioned earlier, there's no one clear standard. There's a lot of publications out there that use this term, and really it comes down to a very simple acknowledgement that when you're using risk to make the decision, then it's a risk-based decision. As long as you kind of explicitly take into account the amount of impact on the likelihood and severity of harm. So as you saw in the earlier modules, there's other things that can come into account. There's things like cost and practicality and how they can be implemented, and these are all reasonable things to be impacted. So you don't make the decision only based on risk, because that would kind of lead to a situation in which you couldn't always move forward. So you want to take these other things into account as well, and it still would be considered a risk-based decision. So there was a National Academies report back in 2010 in the United States that called Enhancing Food Safety, and about food safety at the FDA. And it put forward a definition of risk-based decision making, but it was more a list of things that were true when you use a risk-based decision making approach. So this diagram is a kind of very general one about decision making practices, and it's added some risk qualities to it in this version. So we talk about strategic planning, which is where you're really defining what your problem is, how big of a problem you're looking at. Public health risk ranking. We're going to have another short course on risk ranking, and how that's used. But it's basically using information on risk to prioritize. Then you have information gathering, analysis, and selection of the intervention. That's the decision. Design of an intervention plan, which is how you would implement, and then some kind of evaluation and monitoring of that plan. So these are kind of basic plan, do, act kind of steps, and we've applied them here in the risk-based decision-making context. In addition, there's a couple of important factors that are true when you have a risk-based decision-making system. Things like being proactive, not reactive, being data-driven, using data that you have available and seeking out more data to inform your decisions. Grounded in risk analysis, systematic and transparent, ranking risk based on public health impact, so you have information on how much likelihood and severity of harm each hazard has, and you use that to inform your decisions. Prioritizing allocation of resources to manage risk, so that's again using risk-based thinking to help drive your budget decisions. And then also, as I mentioned earlier, it does consider other factors such as cost and other things. And then you really have this continuous evaluation. That's another fundamental feature of a risk-based decision-making process, and involves all the stakeholders. So these are all things that are good practice and can be defined as part of a risk-based decision-making approach for a food safety system. So let's go back to our consequence table that we saw before and kind of break it down in terms of this risk-based lens. So if you think about where's the risk in this decision, you could say that the first place where you see risk is in the effectiveness, because you would measure effectiveness in terms of the reduction of risk. So if you have an estimate of how likely something is to happen, it would be a reduction in that likelihood. If you have an estimate of how severe the outcomes would be, it would be a reduction in that severity. How we measure that, we're going to talk about in another lecture. But so effectiveness in terms of the goal of reducing microbial contamination would be your first risk measure. And then I would argue also that the weight of evidence is part of the risk measure, because that's really getting to the uncertainty that you have about the outcomes. So how sure are you that intervention A will lead to that reduction in illness? Well, that has to do with the weight of evidence and how much information you really have to back up that estimate of effectiveness. So if you weren't using a risk-based decision-making approach, this consequence table would look different. It would just look like this. It would say, well, we're only going to evaluate interventions based on how much they cost and how practical they are. And when we're coming at it from this way, you might think that's ridiculous. No one would ever do that. But it actually does happen a lot. And when people are trying to make decisions, they might just, for example, take the cheapest option, or they might just take something that's pretty easy to implement. So I'm using this as a kind of extreme example to show you that when you're doing risk-based decision making, you are explicitly taking those into account, and in terms of how much effectiveness you have. So you might be surprised when you start looking around at some of the decisions that have been made in food safety around the world, and in other sectors as well, in environmental and public health more generally. And there you can find evidence of cases in which decisions were made without kind of explicit consideration of the impact on the risk, and those would not be called risk-based decisions. So there's a few other approaches to decision making that I wanted to share with you, again, to kind of illustrate exactly what is meant by risk-based decision making. So it might seem like common sense that everyone would use this, but there are cases in which maybe it's not being used. So there's three alternatives, kind of official alternatives to risk-based decision making. The one I just showed you is more just kind of an omission of risk information. But there's traditional decision making, there's hazard-based, and then there's the precautionary approach. So I'll go through examples of each of those just to help you see how those relate to each other and how they relate to risk-based decision making. So first, traditional decision making. I mentioned this earlier in one of the earlier modules, that often it's the situation where people will kind of choose their favorite option and then just argue for it. And really it comes down to how strong can your argument be, who can you convince to come to your side. Often, as I mentioned also, only one option is offered, so it's like you just say yes or no to this, as opposed to comparing the options across different alternatives. Some people talk about using pros and cons. That's a very simple tool for decision making that it's not a terrible approach, but it doesn't get to the comparison pieces. But at least it does start to identify the different outcomes that you care about and what's good and bad about each option, but it's not quite all the way to building that consequence table. So decision analysis research has shown that this traditional method leads to lower quality decisions. And again, going back to our definition of a good decision is something that aligns with the preferences of the decision maker. So when you take this traditional approach, there's really no process for ensuring that the option that you select is the best in terms of the preferences of the decision maker. Hazard-based decision making is another kind of general approach that people might take. And this is where people don't look at the likelihood of the harm, they just look at the severity of it. So it takes it's kind of a part of a risk-based decision, but it doesn't take the whole piece into account. Excuse me. So a hazard is something that has the potential to harm you. A risk is something that has a known likelihood of harming you. So this diagram shows those two elements in relation to each other. So making decisions based only on hazard does not account for the chance of it not being harmful. So for example, you might hear someone talk about a certain kind of contaminant in a food. And they say, well, this is a contaminant in the food, and the implication is that it's bad just because it's in the food. But without the likelihood of harm part, you don't know how bad that could be. And the truth is, if we had unlimited resources to deal with all kinds of hazards in our food, we wouldn't be opposed to having food that didn't have contaminants in it. But risk-based decision making is really driven by the idea that there are always limited resources. Whether even if you have a lot of funding, you have limited resources in terms of people's time and attention to work on these problems. So you're always going to have to choose some things to work on and some things not to work on. And so the detrimental part of hazard-based decision making is that it could direct resources away from things that are more likely to happen. That could be potentially more risky because you're not taking that likelihood piece into account. So here's a slide I found from the European Food Information Council that I thought was very useful in demonstrating this point. So the hazard is the Campylobacter in raw chicken. So that the hazard's in the chicken, but there's been no exposure yet, so there's no likelihood of harm yet. If we had good processes for cooking and handling that would eliminate all the Campylobacter in the chicken, then it wouldn't become a risk. And that's the part that calculates the likelihood of harm. So eating undercooked chicken is a risk because then you know that you're eating something that has this Campylobacter contamination in it. But if you're not eating undercooked chicken and you're able to eliminate all that hazard, then that's no longer a risk. So that's really trying to separate the idea of hazard from risk. The fourth approach I wanted to mention is the precautionary approach. And this is the idea that any kind of new process, product, or policy should really be approached with caution and maybe even resisted until there's ample proof that it's safe. So uncertainty is almost always present in food safety decisions, and it just means when you don't really have all the information that you would want. And so the main limitation of the precautionary principle is that it doesn't really allow for these trade-offs and uncertainty. So when you have some uncertainty in the risk, but then you also have potential benefits, you might want to you might want to move forward without having to completely eliminate the option of using that option. So because of the automatic approach to anything that could possibly be cautious, this type of approach really can slow down the interventions that could be developed because they're not being invested in and so on. So this is another alternative, and for some types of contaminants and some types of concerns, this might be an approach that a government will take. And it's just be aware that there are trade-offs to taking this approach. So showing you those two examples, those three examples, really traditional, precautionary, and hazard-based, hopefully gives you an demonstration of what risk decision making is relative to those three. So I hope that you were able to follow along with this module and that you were able to achieve these objectives of understanding when decision analysis is needed, especially why it's useful for risk decision making because of the difficulty of those decisions, and then understanding what is meant by a risk-based decision.